"We need to talk," Mark said, his voice unnervingly steady as he loosened his Hermès tie, the one I'd given him for our 3rd anniversary. The kitchen marble felt cold beneath my palms as I steadied myself, instinctively placing one hand over my barely visible 5-month pregnancy bump. "Can it wait? I've got the ultrasound pictures to show you. We might be able to tell if it's a boy or I want a divorce." 3 words, 4 syllables, one irrevocable fracture across the pristine surface of what I'd thought was the perfect marriage. I stared at my husband of 6 years, trying to reconcile the man before me with the one who had cried when I showed him the positive pregnancy test just 4 months earlier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "You're joking," I said, but the perfectly composed expression on his face already gave me my answer. Mark was many things: ambitious, calculated, strategic, but never cruel. Until now. He placed his briefcase on our kitchen island, clicking it open with practiced precision. "I've already spoken with Andrew. The papers will be ready next week." Andrew, our friend, our attorney, the same man who'd been the best man at our wedding, who'd toasted to our lifetime of happiness. "You spoke to Andrew before speaking to me? About ending our marriage?" The kitchen suddenly felt too large, too empty, the 12-foot ceilings too high, the custom cabinetry too perfect. Everything we'd chosen together now seemed like a showroom display, beautiful but ultimately hollow. Mark pulled out a folder and slid it across the marble countertop. "This outlines the proposed division of assets. I'm being more than fair, Caroline. You'll get the beach house in Nantucket. I think that's generous considering your contribution to our assets. My contribution? As if the 6 years I'd spent supporting his rise from associate to partner at Griffin Capital hadn't been contribution enough. As if carrying his child wasn't contribution enough. What about the baby, Mark?" My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. Something flickered across his face. Not regret, not sadness, but something closer to annoyance. "I'll provide child support, of course. I'm not a monster." "You could have fooled me." The words escaped before I could stop them, but I didn't regret them. He sighed, checking his Patek Philippe watch, another gift from me. "Let's not make this difficult, Caroline. We both know this marriage has run its course. You want different things now. You want to be a mother. I want—" "What, Mark? What do you want that's so incompatible with the life we built, the life we planned?" I couldn't stop my voice from cracking. "Stephanie." He said the name casually, as if commenting on the weather. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Stephanie, his 26-year-old assistant. The one he'd insisted on hiring despite her conspicuous lack of qualifications. The one with the Cornell MBA and the perfectly highlighted blonde hair. The one I'd invited to our Christmas party last year, where she'd hugged me and complimented the vintage Chanel dress my grandmother had left me. How cliché of you. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Your pregnant wife and your assistant. Did you come up with that all by yourself, or did you pull it from some midlife crisis handbook? Mark's jaw tightened. I didn't come here to be insulted, Caroline. No, you came here to detonate our marriage while I'm carrying your child. Excuse me if I don't receive the news with grace and dignity. He looked away, his gaze landing on the ultrasound photo I'd left on the counter earlier that day. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw hesitation cross his face. I never wanted children, he said finally. You knew that. We discussed it for years, Mark. You changed your mind. You told me you changed your mind. My hands were shaking now. You wept when I showed you the test. I was in shock, he said, his voice flat. I've had time to process it now. Process it? It's not a business setback, Mark. It's your child. closed his briefcase with a definitive click. I'm staying at the Four Seasons until the papers are ready. You have my number if you need anything. Practical. Practical. As if any of this was practical. As if dissolving 6 years of marriage while I was pregnant was something to be managed with spreadsheets and asset allocations. Does she know? I asked as he turned to leave. He paused. Know what? Does Stephanie know about the Marcus deal? I kept my voice conversational even as I saw his shoulders tense. The Marcus deal. The acquisition that would put Griffin Capital, and Mark specifically, on the map. The deal that had consumed the last 8 months of our lives with late nights, strategy sessions at our dining table, and endless revisions of presentations. That's none of her concern, he said carefully. Or yours anymore. I smiled thinly. You might want to check with Robert Marcus directly about that. Mark turned slowly, his expression shifting from dismissive to wary. What are you talking about? Robert and Diana invited us to dinner next week. Well, invited me specifically. They want to discuss the children's hospital wing the Marcus Foundation is funding. I ran my finger along the edge of the marble countertop. Did I forget to mention that? Diana and I sit on the hospital board together. For the first time since entering our kitchen, Mark looked uncertain. Robert Marcus's technology empire was the acquisition target Griffin Capital had been circling for months, but it was notoriously difficult to get close to the Marcus family. They were old money, suspicious of financial sharks like Griffin Capital and the partners who worked there. You never mentioned knowing Diana Marcus personally, he said slowly. You never asked. I held his gaze. Funny how that works. He took a step toward me, his expression calculating. Caroline, I think you should leave now, Mark. You've made your position clear. I'll have my attorney contact Andrew. Your attorney? He almost smiled. You don't have an attorney, Caroline. I reached for my phone. Catherine Sanders from Lowell, Prentice, and Barnes. She handled my father's estate. I have her on speed dial. The mention of my father's estate caused another flicker of something across Mark's face. When we'd met, I'd been Caroline Bennett, the unremarkable art history graduate working at the Metropolitan Museum, the daughter of a history professor and a librarian. Or so he'd thought. What Mark had never known, what I'd carefully obscured from everyone in my New York life, was that my father, the history professor, was actually Richard Bennett of the New England Bennetts, with a family fortune dating back to shipping and railroad interests in the 19th century. My father had indeed taught history, but he'd done so from a position funded by his own family's endowment, more for passion than need. The modest lifestyle we'd maintained had been his philosophical choice, not financial necessity. And the trust fund he'd established for me had remained untouched, growing quietly in the background of my life. Caroline, be reasonable, Mark said, his tone shifting to the one he used with difficult clients. I'm trying to make this simple for both of us. Nothing about abandoning your pregnant wife for your assistant is simple, Mark. Now please leave. He hesitated, clearly recalculating his approach. The Marcus connection had thrown him. I could see it in the tight line of his mouth. We should discuss the Marcus situation, he said finally. We can discuss it through our attorneys. I walked to the door, pulling it open. Goodbye, Mark. After one last calculating look, he left, the sound of his Italian loafers echoing on. The hardwood before the door closed behind him. Only then did I allow myself to sink to the floor, one hand still protectively curved around my small bump. Tears came, hot and furious. But beneath the hurt was something else. Something I'd inherited from the Bennett side of the family, along with the trust fund. Resolve. My phone buzzed with a text from Mark. We should talk about the Marcus dinner. Before you do anything hasty. Breakfast tomorrow? I deleted it without responding, then scrolled to a different contact. Catherine? It's Caroline Bennett. I need to speak with you first thing tomorrow about divorce proceedings. And I'd like to finally access my trust fund. The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. 9 a.m. my office. And Caroline? I'm sorry. I placed the phone down and took a deep breath. Mark had made his choice, thinking I was the safer one to discard, the pregnant, financially dependent wife who would gratefully accept the Nantucket beach house as fair compensation for her contribution. He had no idea what was coming. Catherine Sanders's office at Lowell, Prentice, and Barnes exuded old money and discretion, all dark wood, leather-bound books, and discreet Ivy League diplomas. At 62, Catherine herself matched her surroundings, silver-haired, impeccably tailored, with the confident bearing of someone who had spent decades navigating the intersection of wealth and family dynamics. He did what? Catherine's normally composed expression gave way to rare indignation as I finished explaining the situation. He wants a divorce. For his 26-year-old assistant, I repeated, surprised by how steady my voice remained. A night of tears had given way to clarity and purpose. While you're 5 months pregnant. Catherine shook her head. I've been practicing family law for 38 years, and the audacity still manages to surprise me sometimes. I managed a small smile. He thinks I'm getting the better end of the deal. The Nantucket house and child support. Catherine's perfectly arched eyebrow rose. Does he now? And I assume he still doesn't know about the trust? No. I shifted in my seat, adjusting the Burberry coat I'd thrown over a simple black dress. My father was adamant that I keep it private, and after seeing how wealth changed some of my cousins' relationships, I agreed with him. Richard was a wise man, Catherine said softly. She had been my father's classmate at Yale before becoming his attorney and friend. But Caroline, this changes things. You're having a child. Mark's behavior demonstrates a fundamental breach of good faith. I know. Have you thought about what you want to do? I nodded slowly, my hand instinctively moving to my stomach. I spent the night thinking about it. I don't want Mark back. He's shown me exactly who he is. But I do want him to face consequences for his choices, and I want to protect my child from ever feeling abandoned or second best. Catherine nodded, understanding in her eyes. Then it's time to access your trust and show your soon-to-be ex-husband exactly who he's dealing with. She turned to her computer. Let me pull up the current status. As she typed, I gazed out the window at the Manhattan skyline. 6 years ago, I'd met Mark at a museum fundraiser. He'd been charming, ambitious, seemingly kind. I'd fallen for him quickly, and when he'd proposed a year later, I'd chosen to keep my background private. Not out of deception, but out of a desire to be loved for myself rather than my family name or resources. My father had understood. Test his character first, he'd advised before his sudden death from a heart attack 3 years ago. A man who loves you for you will be worthy of knowing the whole truth later. Mark had failed that test spectacularly. Caroline, Catherine's voice drew me back to the present. Your trust is currently valued at approximately $78 million. Despite knowing the rough figure, hearing it stated so plainly made me blink. And is it still structured as my father arranged? Yes. Upon activation, you'll have immediate access to the income generated, roughly $3 million annually. The principal remains protected for your lifetime and will pass to your children, but you have significant latitude in investment decisions. She looked up from the screen. There's also the matter of your father's art collection, which was kept separate from the trust. The pieces have appreciated considerably. I nodded, thinking of the Monet and the small Renoir sketch currently in climate-controlled storage. My father had collected thoughtfully over decades, pieces that spoke to him rather than flashy status symbols. What are you thinking? Catherine asked after a moment. I'm thinking that Mark has no idea who he married, I said quietly. And it's time he found out. Catherine's lips curved into a smile that had likely struck fear into countless opposing counsels over the decades. I was hoping you'd say that. Now, let's discuss strategy. For the next hour, we mapped out a plan. Catherine would file for divorce immediately, requesting temporary support and exclusive use of our apartment while pregnant. But unlike what Mark would expect from the unremarkable art history graduate he thought he'd married, these would be opening moves in a much more sophisticated game. We'll need to act quickly regarding Griffin Capital, Catherine said, making notes. Mark's position there gives him certain advantages we should neutralize. I've already thought about that, I replied. I've known Robert Marcus socially for years through the hospital board. I can reach out directly. Catherine nodded approvingly. Good. What about living arrangements? Are you comfortable staying in the apartment? I considered this. Our Tribeca loft had been my home for 6 years, filled with art I'd carefully selected, and furniture we'd chosen together. But now it felt contaminated by betrayal. Actually, I think I might prefer a change, I said slowly. My grandmother's apartment on Fifth Avenue has been sitting empty since she moved to her Palm Beach house permanently. Catherine's eyebrows rose. The Bennett residence? That's 16 rooms overlooking the park, Caroline. I know. It's probably excessive for one person and a baby, but it makes a statement, Catherine finished for me. And positioning matters in situations like this. By the time I left Catherine's office, we had a clear plan of action. She would file the divorce papers immediately with terms that would make Mark's head spin. Meanwhile, I had calls to make, starting with Diana Marcus. As I stepped into the crisp autumn air, my phone buzzed with a text from Mark. Caroline, we need to talk. The Marcus deal is crucial. Just hear me out. I ignored it, instead opening my contacts to find Diana's number. Mark had made his choice, thinking I was the path of least resistance, the one with everything to lose. He was about to discover how catastrophically he had miscalculated. Diana Marcus answered on the second ring. Caroline, I was just thinking about you. How are you feeling? Robert and I can't wait to see you next week. Actually, Diana, I was hoping we might meet sooner. There have been some developments I'd like to discuss with you and Robert. I kept my voice calm and measured as I signaled for a taxi. Is everything all right? Concern colored her voice. Diana was in her 60s, with 3 grown children and 7 grandchildren. She had taken a grandmotherly interest in me since we'd begun working together on the hospital board. I'm fine, but my personal situation has changed significantly. It might have implications for some of the business matters Robert is considering. I chose my words carefully, aware that phone conversations weren't always private. There was a pause, and then Diana's voice returned, sharper and more focused. Despite her philanthropic persona, Diana had been raised in a family of steel magnates and had a renowned business acumen of her own. Lunch today. Robert is in town. That would be perfect. Thank you, Diana. The townhouse, 1 o'clock. And Caroline? Whatever it is, we'll figure it out. The Marcus townhouse on East 70th Street was a masterpiece of understated elegance. 6 stories of limestone housing one of the most influential families in American technology. The butler who admitted me, Richardson, had known me for years through various charity events. Miss Bennett, he greeted me, a flicker of surprise crossing his face at the use of my maiden name on his announcement card. Mrs. Marcus is expecting. You in the library. Diana embraced me warmly when I entered, then held me at arm's length, her eyes taking in my appearance. You're glowing, despite whatever has happened. The baby is well? The baby is perfect, I assured her, placing a hand on my small bump. Everything else is complicated. Then let's uncomplicate it, came a deep voice from the doorway. Robert Marcus stood there, still imposing at 70. The founder of Marcus Technologies had built an empire from a garage startup in the 1980s, and unlike many tech founders, he'd managed to remain CEO for 4 decades without being ousted by his board or losing his edge. After warm greetings and lunch in the garden room, during which we carefully avoided the elephant in the room, Robert led us to his study, where he closed the door and activated what he casually referred to as a privacy screen. "Old habits?" he explained with a small smile. "Too many corporate espionage attempts over the years. Now, what's this about, Caroline?" I took a deep breath and told them everything. Mark's demand for divorce, his relationship with Stephanie, his dismissive attitude toward our child, and his assumption about my financial status. I also explained my family background and why I'd kept it private. "The Bennett shipping family," Robert nodded thoughtfully. "I remember your grandfather from Yale Corporation meetings. Formidable man. Quiet but lethal in the boardroom." "The apple doesn't fall far," Diana remarked, studying me with new appreciation. I smiled slightly. I've never had to be lethal before, but circumstances change. "And Griffin Capital?" Robert asked, his fingers steepled under his chin. "Mark's firm has been pursuing acquisition talks rather aggressively." "I know," I said. "Mark has been working on the presentation for months. The partnership track at Griffin depends heavily on the success of the Marcus acquisition." Robert's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you're telling us this because I believe you should have complete information before making any business decisions. Mark's personal ethics are now in question. And while I would never ask you to make a business decision based on my personal situation, you want us to know exactly who we might be getting into bed with," Robert finished. "Metaphorically speaking, yes." Diana and Robert exchanged a look, the silent communication of a couple who had been partners in every sense for over 40 years. "Caroline," Robert said finally, "Griffin Capital has been pursuing Marcus Technologies for 9 months. Their offer is aggressive. Some of my board members are intrigued." My heart sank slightly, but I nodded. "I understand. Business is business. However," he continued, "I've been in this industry long enough to know that character matters. The people behind the deals matter. I was on the fence about Griffin Capital before. Their reputation is mixed. Now, knowing what I know about their rising star partner," he shook his head, "it gives me pause." "Robert doesn't trust easily," Diana added. "Neither do I. But we trust you, Caroline." "Thank you," I said simply. "That means more than you know." Robert leaned forward. "Let me be blunt. I wasn't excited about Griffin's approach in the first place. Their valuation metrics undervalue our R&D pipeline, and their post-acquisition integration plans would dismantle the corporate culture we've spent 40 years building." He smiled slightly. "I was entertaining their offer primarily to drive up interest from other potential partners I like better." I found myself smiling back. Strategic negotiation. Exactly. Now, here's what I propose. I'm going to decline Griffin's request for an exclusive negotiation window. I'll cite concerns about their corporate culture alignment. He paused. "It will effectively kill their acquisition hopes without explicitly mentioning your situation." Relief washed over me, followed quickly by determination. "I appreciate that, Robert. But I'm not asking you to fight my battles." "Consider it fighting my own," he replied. "I protect my family, my company, and my friends from people who lack integrity. It's simply good business." He hesitated, then added, "There is one other thing. The Children's Hospital Wing project is important to Diana and me. We were hoping you would consider taking a more formal role in its development, perhaps as a liaison between the hospital board and the Marcus Foundation." Diana nodded. "A paid position, with flexible hours suitable for a new mother, if you're interested." The offer caught me by surprise. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Diana encouraged. "You have an excellent eye for detail, you understand. Both the medical needs and the aesthetic considerations. And frankly, we trust you." The position would come with a substantial salary and benefits package. Independence. Professional purpose. A role that would allow me to use my art history background while making a meaningful difference, and the flexibility to prioritize my child. I would be honored, I said finally. As I prepared to leave, Robert stopped me with a gentle hand on my arm. Caroline, one piece of advice from someone who's seen his share of business conflicts. Don't just win definitively. Make it clear that crossing you has consequences. I nodded, thinking of the plans Catherine and I had already set in motion. I intend to. Outside the Marcus townhouse, I checked my phone to find 8 missed calls and a dozen texts from Mark, each more urgent than the last. The final one read, "Caroline, Griffin is in crisis mode." Marcus suddenly backed out of talks. "I need to know what you said to them. My career is on the line." I slipped the phone back into my purse without responding and hailed a taxi. "Fifth Avenue and 78th, please," I told the driver, giving the address of my grandmother's apartment, soon to be my new home. Mark had chosen Stephanie, thinking I had nothing to offer but dependency and complication. He was about to discover the true cost of underestimating Caroline Bennett. The Bennett family apartment on Fifth Avenue had been closed up for nearly 2 years, ever since my grandmother had decided to make Palm Beach her permanent residence. As the elevator doors opened directly into the marble-floored foyer, the familiar scent of lemon oil and old books enveloped me like a forgotten embrace. Miss Caroline. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper who had served my family for over 30 years, rushed forward. Catherine had called ahead to alert the staff about my arrival. "Everything is ready. We've aired out the master suite and prepared the nursery adjacent to it." The nursery. My throat tightened. This apartment had seen generations of Bennett children grow up within its walnut-paneled walls. Now my child, Mark's child, would join that lineage, though under circumstances far different than I'd imagined. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen." I followed her through the grand salon with its hand-painted ceiling murals and into the eastern wing where the family bedrooms were located. The master suite had been my grandparents' domain during my childhood visits, a sanctuary of silk damask and antique rosewood that had seemed magical to my younger self. "Your grandmother had all the bedding replaced last year, even though no one was staying here," Mrs. Chen explained, opening heavy curtains to reveal the panoramic Central Park view. "She always said the apartment should be ready for the next generation." As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from my grandmother. "Darling, I've heard the news. That man never deserved you. I'm booking a flight from Palm Beach. Love, Gran Thigh." Bennett women had never been the type to fall apart in a crisis. Another text soon followed. "I've instructed Carruthers to move your art collection from storage to the apartment. The walls have been empty too long." I smiled despite everything. Eleanor Bennett, at 84, remained a force of nature who believed firmly that proper art on the walls was essential for maintaining civilization. Mrs. Chen showed me to the adjacent room, a sunny corner space that generations of Bennett children had occupied. It had been modernized over the years but retained its original charm with delicate crown moldings and built-in window seats overlooking the park. "This will be perfect for the baby," I said, running my hand over the satin finish of an antique cherrywood dresser. "Mr. Harrington called from the bank," Mrs. Chen added. "He said to tell you that everything is in order and the accounts are active as of this morning." Thomas Harrington, my father's trusted financial advisor and the executor of the Bennett Trust. Catherine must have reached out to him as well. "Thank you. Could you please prepare some tea? I'm expecting a visitor shortly." While Mrs. Chen bustled away, I stood at the nursery window, gazing down at Central Park sprawled below. Joggers circled the reservoir, tourists meandered along tree-lined paths, and yellow taxis created moving dots of color against the greenery. The ordinary rhythm of city life continued, oblivious to personal upheavals. My phone buzzed again. Mark, for the 14th time. Caroline, I'm outside our apartment. Where are you? We need to talk. Everything is falling apart at Griffin. I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction before typing, I've moved out. Any further communication should go through my attorney, Catherine Sanders, at Lowell, Prentice & Barnes. His response was immediate. You hired a lawyer? Caroline, be reasonable. Where are you staying? I didn't respond. Instead, I took a photograph of the Central Park view from my window and sent it to Catherine with the message, settling in. Let me know when the papers have been filed. 20 minutes later, the house phone rang. Miss Carolyn, Mrs. Chen called. The doorman says Ms. Sanders is on her way up. Catherine arrived carrying a sleek leather portfolio and a determined expression. I filed the papers an hour ago, she announced, accepting the tea Mrs. Chen offered. Mark's attorney has been served. Andrew? I asked, settling into one of the silk-upholstered chairs in what had been my grandfather's study. No. Catherine's mouth curved in a slight smile. Andrew mysteriously became unavailable when I called the firm. They've assigned it to Jennifer Oakes instead. I don't know her. She's excellent. One of the top divorce attorneys in the city. Very sharp, very thorough. Catherine arranged documents on the mahogany desk. It means they're taking this seriously. Because of the Marcus deal falling through? Partly, but mostly because I included your financial disclosures with the initial filing. Catherine's eyes glinted with professional satisfaction. I believe the technical term for their reaction is shell-shocked. I couldn't help smiling. I wish I could have seen Andrew's face when he realized who I really am. You might get your chance. I received 3 calls from him while driving. Over here, all mysteriously about exploring amicable solutions and avoiding unnecessary confrontation. She sipped her tea. I've scheduled a preliminary meeting for tomorrow morning. I assume you'd like to attend? Absolutely. Good. I've also initiated the process to freeze certain assets as we discussed. Catherine handed me several documents requiring signatures. This prevents Mark from making any large monetary movements or property transfers until the divorce is finalized. As I signed, Catherine continued, Thomas Harrington called. The trust fund activation is complete. Your personal accounts now show the first quarterly distribution, and he's arranged for new credit cards to be delivered this afternoon. That was fast. Richard set everything up meticulously before he died. The structure was always there, just waiting for your signature to activate it. Catherine hesitated. There's something else you should know. Mark attempted to access your joint investment account this morning. He tried to transfer $200,000 to a newly opened personal account. My hand stilled over the paperwork. Did he succeed? No. The freeze order was already in effect, but it shows intent. Catherine's voice softened slightly. Caroline, I know you're hurt, but don't lose sight of the larger picture. This isn't just about punishing Mark. It's about securing your future and your child's future. I understand. I placed a protective hand over my bump. What happens tomorrow? Tomorrow is just preliminary, establishing positions, setting temporary arrangements for support and residence while the divorce proceeds. Catherine gathered the signed documents, but it sets the tone for everything that follows. After Catherine left, I wandered through the apartment, reacquainting myself with rooms that featured prominently in my childhood memories. The library with its 2-story walls of books, the formal dining room where my grandfather had taught me to appreciate fine wines, much to my father's amusement. The music room with its Steinway grand piano where I'd practiced Chopin preludes under my mother's patient guidance. This wasn't just an apartment. It was a legacy, one that my child would now inherit. My phone rang. Diana Marcus. Caroline, dear, Robert asked me to check on you. Is there anything you need? I'm fine, Diana, just settling in. Robert spoke with Griffin Capital's CEO this afternoon. Her voice held a note of satisfaction. He made it very clear that their handling of the acquisition approach raised concerns about their corporate culture, without mentioning names, of course. Of course. There's talk of a shakeup at Griffin. Apparently, someone overpromised and underdelivered. Diana paused. Robert also mentioned that your position with the foundation will be announced next week. The paperwork is being prepared. After we hung up, I sent a brief email to the hospital board, resigning from my volunteer position and explaining that I would be joining the Marcus Foundation in a professional capacity. Within minutes, my inbox flooded with congratulatory responses. The same board members who had always treated me as Mark's appendage, suddenly discovering I had value of my own. As evening fell, I sat in the library with a cup of herbal tea, watching lights come on across Central Park. The doorman called up to announce that several large crates had arrived, my art collection being delivered as my grandmother had promised. Mrs. Chen brought me a printed email from Carruthers, the family art manager. Miss Bennett, per your grandmother's instructions, I've sent the primary collection pieces. The Monet deserves the spot above the salon fireplace, where your grandfather always preferred it. The Renoir sketch would complement the morning room nicely. The remainder are catalogued in the attached inventory. Call if you require assistance. With placement. The doorbell chimed around 9 o'clock. Miss Caroline, Mrs. Chen called from the foyer, her voice strained. Mr. Morrison is here. I froze. Then, gathering myself, I placed my tea on the side table and stood. Show him to the library, please. Mark strode in moments later, his usual confident demeanor fractured by confusion and barely suppressed anger. He stopped abruptly, taking in the two-story book-lined room with its priceless antiques and the Central Park views beyond the windows. What the hell is this place? He demanded. And why am I being served divorce papers by Lowell, Prentice, and Barnes? This is my family's apartment, I replied calmly. And you're being served because you asked for a divorce. I'm simply accommodating your request. His eyes darted around the room, cataloging details with the quickly calculating mind that had made him successful in finance. Your family's apartment, he repeated. The family you said were academics. My father was an academic, a very well-funded one. I gestured to the leather chair across from mine. Would you like to sit? He remained standing. You've been lying to me for 6 years. I withheld certain financial information, yes. I met his gaze steadily. Just as you withheld the fact that you were sleeping with your assistant. A muscle jumped in his jaw. Caroline, this is insane. You hire one of the most expensive law firms in Manhattan, move into what is clearly a multi-million-dollar apartment, and somehow sabotage the Marcus deal? What game are you playing? I'm not playing games, Mark. I'm simply operating from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. I picked up my tea. Something you didn't anticipate when you decided to discard your pregnant wife. I never said. He stopped himself, visibly working to regain control. Look, I was hasty. We should talk about this rationally. That's why I suggested attorneys. I kept my voice even. They can help us navigate this rationally. Mark ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration from someone who prided himself on composure. The partners are furious. The Marcus deal was supposed to be locked down. Instead, Robert Marcus personally called our CEO to express cultural alignment concerns. Do you have any idea what that's done to my position? I imagine it's compromised it significantly, I replied. Much like my discovery of your affair, compromised our marriage. His expression shifted, the anger giving way to something more calculating. Mark had always been adaptive. It was what made him valuable to Griffin Capital. Caroline, he said, his voice softening as he finally took the seat opposite me. I made a mistake, a terrible one. I was stressed about the deal, about the pregnancy, about everything changing at once. He leaned forward. But we can work through this. We don't need lawyers. We don't need a divorce. I studied him silently. 6 years of marriage had taught me to read every nuance of his expressions, the slight tightness around his eyes, the carefully modulated tone. The way his gaze kept returning to the valuable objects in the room, reassessing my worth with each glance. You don't want me back, Mark. You want access to the Bennett name and fortune now that you know it exists. I placed a protective hand over my small bump. And perhaps custody leverage for child support negotiations. His eyes widened briefly, a tell that I'd assessed correctly. That's not true, he protested. I care about you, about our family. Which is why you were prepared to leave me last week for Stephanie. I shook my head. Has she been updated on your change of heart, by the way? Or is she waiting in the wings while you explore this more lucrative option? Mark's expression hardened. You've changed, Caroline. No, Mark. I've simply stopped hiding parts of myself that you never bothered to see. I stood, signaling the end of our conversation. My attorney will meet with yours tomorrow at 10. Any discussions about our future should happen there. This isn't over, he said, rising as well. It was over the moment you asked for a divorce while I was carrying your child. I walked toward the library door. Mrs. Chen will show you out. After he left, I returned to the window, watching until I saw his figure emerge onto Fifth Avenue below. He stood for a moment looking up at the building before turning and walking toward Madison Avenue, phone already pressed to his ear. My own phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. Mark's attorney requested an urgent call. Says he wants to discuss terms before tomorrow's meeting. I declined. Perfect, I replied. See you at 9 tomorrow to prepare. Morning came with a flurry of activity. My grandmother's flight had been delayed due to weather in Palm Beach, but she had sent the family driver to escort me to the law firm. Mrs. Chen helped me select an outfit appropriate for the occasion, a custom Chanel maternity dress in navy, wool with a matching jacket, accessorized with a simple strand of Bennett pearls. You look like your mother, Mrs. Chen said approvingly, adjusting the jacket. Strong. The Bennett pearls had been passed through generations, worn by the women. In my family during their most significant life moments, my mother had worn them at her wedding, at my father's funeral, and during particularly challenging board meetings for the various foundations she chaired. Today, they felt like armor. Catherine met me in the lobby of Lowell, Prentice and Barnes, 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting. Mark and Jennifer Oakes arrived early, she informed me. They're already in the conference room. Attempting to establish dominance through promptness, I remarked, remembering Mark's fondness for such psychological tactics in business settings. It won't help them, Catherine replied with the confidence of someone who had been negotiating high-stakes divorces since before Mark was born. Are you ready? I nodded, straightening the Bennett pearls. Completely. The conference room was all polished walnut and city views, designed to project power and tradition. Mark and Jennifer Oakes sat on one side of the long table, both in dark suits that practically screamed serious financial professionals. Mark's expression when I entered was worth every moment of the 6 years I'd kept my background private. A mixture of shock, reassessment, and quickly masked anger at seeing me dressed not as the art history graduate he'd married, but as the Bennett heiress I'd always been. Caroline, he said, standing. You look well. Thank you, I replied coolly, taking the seat Catherine pulled out for me. Jennifer Oakes was perhaps 45, with the keen gaze of a woman who had navigated the shark-infested waters of New York divorce law for decades. Ms. Bennett, she greeted me, the use of my maiden name a deliberate acknowledgement of the shifting power dynamic. I'm Jennifer Oakes. I'll be representing Mr. Morrison in these proceedings. Ms. Oakes, I nodded. This is Catherine Sanders. Who will be representing me? Catherine and I have crossed paths before, Jennifer said with professional courtesy. Shall we begin? What followed was a master class in legal negotiation. Jennifer opened with what she termed a generous proposal that would have given me the Nantucket beach house, modest child support, and a small settlement, essentially what Mark had initially offered. Catherine smiled thinly and slid a counter-proposal across the table. My client's terms. Jennifer's eyebrows rose fractionally as she reviewed the document. She leaned over to whisper something to Mark, whose face had gone increasingly pale. "This is absurd," he finally said, pushing the paper away. "Full custody? 70%. Of our marital assets? Restrictions on my visitation rights? On what grounds?" "Adultery for starters," Catherine replied evenly. "Abandonment of a pregnant spouse. Attempted financial misconduct pre-divorce." "The attempt to transfer $200,000 yesterday," I clarified, meeting Mark's gaze directly. "From our joint investment account to your new personal one." His jaw tightened. "That was my money." "Actually, it was marital property," Catherine corrected. "And the attempt to transfer it after being informed of divorce proceedings constitutes a breach of good faith." Jennifer placed a restraining hand on Mark's arm. "Let's all take a step back. Clearly, there are significant assets involved that weren't initially disclosed." She looked pointedly at me. "Perhaps we should focus first on establishing a clear picture of the financial landscape before discussing distribution." "That seems reasonable," Catherine agreed. "My client has provided full financial disclosure in the filed paperwork. We'll need the same from Mr. Morrison, including all accounts, investments, and any offshore holdings." Mark's expression flickered. Financial transparency had never been his strong suit, even with me. "Of course," Jennifer said smoothly. "We'll provide that promptly. In the meantime, regarding temporary arrangements while the divorce proceeds, my client will remain in her family residence," Catherine interjected. "She requires no temporary support from Mr. Morrison during this period as her income is more than sufficient. However, we do request that the court recognize her exclusive right to make medical decisions regarding her pregnancy and the child's birth." Mark leaned forward. "I have rights as the father. Rights you were willing to minimize just days ago when you asked for a divorce and offered mere child support as your contribution to our baby's life," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. The meeting continued for another hour, establishing preliminary boundaries and agreements. Mark grew increasingly frustrated as each of his attempted power plays was countered by Catherine's experienced rebuttals, backed by the substantial leverage my financial position now provided. When the meeting concluded, Jennifer requested a moment alone with Catherine to discuss scheduling, leaving Mark and me in the conference room together. "You could have told me," he said after a moment of tense silence. "About what, Mark? My family? My trust fund?" I shook my head. Would it have mattered 6 years ago? Would you have treated me differently if you'd known I was Caroline Bennett, rather than just Caroline? "Of course not," he said automatically, but we both knew it was a lie. "You married the museum employee with the art history degree. You were content with that until something shinier came along." I gathered my handbag, preparing to leave. "Now you're reassessing your options based on new financial information. It's what you do professionally, after all. Assess assets and liabilities. That's not fair. Neither is abandoning your pregnant wife for your 26-year-old assistant." I stood, one hand instinctively cradling my bump. "The difference is, I'm not the liability you thought I was." As I turned to leave, Mark said quietly, "The partners have put me on probation. The Marcus deal was supposed to be my path to senior partnership." I paused at the door. "Actions have consequences, Mark, professionally and personally." "Caroline." His voice had lost its usual confident edge. "What do you really want out of this?" I considered the question seriously. What did I want? Revenge? Justice? Security? "I want what's best for our child," I finally answered. And I want to never again be underestimated by someone who claimed to love me. Catherine was waiting in the hallway. "Productive first round," she commented as we walked toward the elevator. "Jennifer's a formidable opponent, but she knows they're on shaky ground. And Mark? He's reassessing his position with every new piece of information." Catherine pressed the lobby button. "Men like him are predictable that way. By next week, he'll have a completely new strategy. Based on my family name? Based on everything. The Bennett connection, the Marcus Foundation position, the trust. Fund." Catherine gave me an appraising look. "Are you ready for what comes next? Because he won't give up easily, especially now that he knows what's at stake." The elevator doors opened onto the marble-floored lobby. Through the glass front doors, I could see my grandmother's town car waiting, the driver standing at attention beside it. "I'm a Bennett," I replied, straightening my shoulders. "We've been handling men like Mark for generations." As we crossed the lobby, my phone chimed with a text message. "Diana Marcus. The board approved your position unanimously. Will announce. On Monday. Robert says to tell you the Griffin Capital partners are scrambling. Apparently someone's professional judgment has been called into question." I smiled, slipping the phone back into my bag. Mark had always underestimated the power of connections, the quiet conversations at charity galas, the relationships built through board positions, the networks that operated beneath the surface of New York society. He had chosen Stephanie, thinking I was the easier one to discard. Now he was discovering that some mistakes cannot be undone, only survived, and survival was going to cost him dearly. The announcement of my appointment as the Marcus Foundation's new Director of Arts Integration came on Monday morning via a press release that sent ripples through New York's philanthropic circles. By noon, my email inbox had exploded with congratulatory messages from people I barely knew, board members from various charities, gallery owners, and museum directors suddenly eager to schedule lunch. "The vultures are circling," my grandmother remarked dryly, lowering her reading glasses to scan the social page of the New York Times where the announcement had been featured. Eleanor Bennett had arrived from Palm Beach the previous evening, sweeping into the apartment with the energy of someone half her age, trailed by her personal assistant and a mountain of luggage. "They're not all vultures," I said, sipping my prenatal-approved herbal tea. "Some are genuinely supportive." "3, perhaps," Gran replied with the brutal honesty that had made her both feared and respected among New York's elite. "The rest? Smell money and opportunity," she set aside the newspaper. "Speaking of vultures, what's the latest with Mark?" I shared Catherine's morning update. Mark had hired a private investigator to delve into my background, likely searching for leverage. He'd also requested a complete valuation of all marital assets, a fishing expedition designed to identify anything that might be claimed as joint property. "Standard tactics," Gran sniffed dismissively. "Your grandfather dealt with worse when the Stallworthys tried to take over our shipping interests in '72. She reached for the delicate porcelain teapot, refilling her cup. "The difference is, Richard Bennett had already outmaneuvered them before they even realized they were in a fight. Like father, like daughter?" I suggested with a small smile. "Exactly." Gran's eyes twinkled with approval. "Now, tell me about this meeting with Robert Marcus this afternoon." The Marcus Technologies headquarters occupied the top 10 floors of a gleaming tower in Midtown. Unlike the ostentatious gold and marble that characterized many corporate offices, the Marcus aesthetic was understated. Soft lighting, warm woods, and museum-quality contemporary art that spoke to refined taste rather than showy wealth. Robert's corner office offered panoramic views of the Manhattan skyline, but it was the art on his walls that immediately caught my attention. A small Helen, Frankenthaler canvas vibrant with blues and greens, and what appeared to be an early Rothko sketch. "You have a good eye," Robert noted, following my gaze. "The Frankenthaler was Diana's anniversary gift to me. the Rothko I acquired in the 90s when everyone was still undervaluing his early work. They're exquisite, I said sincerely. Perfect choices for this space. That's precisely why I wanted to meet here rather than at the Foundation offices. Robert gestured to the seating area where Diana was already waiting. Your position will bridge our corporate arts program and the Foundation's cultural initiatives. I wanted you to see both environments. For the next hour, we discussed the scope of my new role, overseeing art acquisitions for both corporate spaces and Foundation-supported public installations, developing arts education programs for the Children's Hospital Wing, and creating community engagement opportunities through the existing Marcus Cultural Framework. The salary and benefits package is outlined here, Diana said, sliding a leather portfolio across the coffee table, including health insurance that covers all prenatal and maternity needs, flexible working hours, and a dedicated office at both locations. I reviewed the document, momentarily stunned by the compensation figure. It was substantially more than I had anticipated, the kind of executive salary that would give me complete financial independence even without my trust fund. This is extremely generous, I managed. It's commensurate with the position and your qualifications, Robert replied, matter-of-factly. We value expertise appropriately at Marcus. After finalizing the employment details, our conversation shifted to more personal matters. Diana had arranged for a private tour of the Children's Hospital Wing construction site later in the week, and both Marcuses had been invited to an upcoming gallery opening that would feature several pieces from my father's collection. Speaking of your collection, Robert said, his tone becoming more businesslike, Diana mentioned that your father had acquired several early tech pioneers' works, specifically the Wozniak diagrams? Yes, the original Apple I sketches. I nodded, recalling the framed technical drawings my father had purchased at auction in the early 2000s. Along with some of the first Microsoft coding sheets, my father had a fascination with the intersection of technology and art. They would make an excellent centerpiece for our innovation museum, Robert said. We've been collecting artifacts from the early days of personal computing, not for their monetary value, but for their historical significance. If you'd ever consider allowing them to be displayed, I'd be happy to loan them, I offered. They're sitting in climate-controlled storage currently. My father would have preferred them to be seen and appreciated. As we concluded our meeting, Robert's assistant appeared with a discreet message. He excused himself briefly, returning with an expression of professional neutrality that didn't quite mask his satisfaction. Interesting development, he commented, resuming his seat. Griffin Capital's board just announced a restructuring of their acquisition team, effective immediately. Diana raised an eyebrow. Mark? Reassigned to their domestic retail division. Robert glanced at me. Not technically a demotion, but certainly a significant shift from leading their technology acquisition strategy. I absorbed this information with mixed emotions. Professional consequences for Mark's actions seemed appropriate, yet I took no joy in another human's downfall, even one who had hurt me deeply. Their loss is our gain, Diana said, squeezing my hand. We're looking forward to your official start next Monday. As my town car pulled away from the Marcus building, my phone rang with Catherine's ringtone. I was just about to call you, I answered. I've accepted the Marcus Foundation position. Excellent timing, Catherine replied. Mark's attorney just reached out. They're requesting a settlement conference, outside of court, just the four of us. Why? My guess? He's feeling the pressure professionally and wants to resolve this quietly before it further impacts his career. Catherine's voice held a note of professional satisfaction. Would tomorrow afternoon work for you? I agreed to the meeting time, then called Gran to update her. She was delighted by the news of Mark's career adjustment. The retail division, she chuckled, where promising young analysts go to die. Richard would have appreciated the poetry of it. When I returned to the apartment, I found Mrs. Chen supervising the delivery of several large pieces of furniture for the nursery. My grandmother had apparently spent her morning ordering a custom crib from a fifth-generation French cabinet maker who owed the Bennett family a favor from some long-ago business arrangement. "Gran, this is too much," I protested, running my hand over the exquisitely carved cherry wood. "Nonsense," she replied from her perch on the window seat. "Bennett children sleep in Bennett cribs. It's tradition." As we discussed nursery colors and bassinet placement, the doorman called up to announce, "Another visitor. Mr. Andrew Caldwell is here to see Miss Caroline." Andrew. Mark's best man. The attorney who had initially prepared the divorce papers before mysteriously becoming unavailable when Catherine entered the picture. "Send him up," I decided after a moment's consideration. He arrived looking distinctly uncomfortable, his usual confident attorney demeanor replaced by an awkward hesitancy. Andrew had been a fixture in our lives for years. Dinner parties, weekend trips to the Hamptons, his wife Melanie among my closest friends. Until now. "Caroline," he greeted me, accepting my invitation to sit in the library. "This is quite a revelation." His gaze traveled over the rare first editions and museum-quality art that adorned the walls. "Yes, well, we all have our secrets." I remained standing, maintaining the slight power advantage. "What can I do for you, Andrew?" He shifted in his seat. "I wanted to see you personally, to explain why I recused myself from your case." Professional. Conflict of interest? Or friendship with Mark? Neither, actually. Andrew looked genuinely troubled. "When Catherine Sanders filed those papers and I realized who you really were, who your family was, I knew I was out of my depth. Family law, involving Bennett trust structures, isn't my specialty." I studied him, trying to determine his sincerity. "You could have told me that from the beginning, instead of preparing divorce papers for my husband without a word of warning to me." "I know." He had the grace to look ashamed. Mark approached me confidentially as his attorney. I was bound by privilege. "And as our friend? What were you bound by then?" Andrew's gaze dropped to his hands. "I deserve that. For what it's worth, I advised him against the entire plan. Told him he was making a catastrophic mistake. But you still prepared the papers." "It's my job." He looked up. "But I didn't know you were pregnant until I saw the filings." Mark never mentioned that detail. This revelation surprised me. He presented divorce papers without telling his attorney I was carrying his child? Andrew nodded grimly. "He said you were separating due to irreconcilable differences. I only learned the full picture after Catherine filed." "And Stephanie?" "He never mentioned her either, though I had my suspicions." Andrew sighed heavily. "Caroline, I'm not here to defend Mark. What he did was indefensible. I'm here because Melanie is worried sick about you, but doesn't know if she's still welcome in your life since I represented Mark initially." Melanie. We had been friends since my early museum days, long before I met Mark. She had been the one to introduce us, in fact, a connection she had likely been regretting deeply. "Tell Melanie she's always welcome," I said finally. "This situation isn't her fault." Andrew visibly relaxed. "Thank you, she'll be relieved." He hesitated, then added, "There's one more thing you should know about Mark's current situation. His reassignment to the retail division?" I raised an eyebrow. "News travels fast." "It's more than that. The partners are questioning his judgment across the board. The Marcus deal collapse was just the catalyst." Andrew lowered his voice despite the privacy of the room. "There are rumors of an SEC review of some of his past deals. Nothing official yet, but this was new information, and potentially significant for our negotiations." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Andrew stood, preparing to leave. "Because despite everything, I care about both of you, and because I believe in fairness." He moved toward the door, then paused. "The settlement conference tomorrow? He's more desperate than you realize. Remember that." After Andrew left, I called, Catherine immediately to relay the information about potential SEC interest in Mark's past deals. That explains the sudden push for settlement, she said thoughtfully. He wants this resolved before any regulatory issues become public. It would strengthen your position considerably if he's facing professional sanctions during divorce proceedings. So, we should delay? Not necessarily, but we should adjust our demands with this new information in mind. Catherine's tone turned contemplative. What do you really want from this divorce, Caroline? Setting aside the hurt and anger, what's your ideal outcome? I considered the question carefully. Financial security for my child, protection from Mark's potential future attempts to weaponize custody for access to the Bennett name or resources, and I hesitated. Some acknowledgement of what he did, not just to me, but to our child. Not financial punishment? That seems to be happening without my assistance, I replied, thinking of Mark's career tailspin. I don't need or want his money. Understood. I'll revise our position for tomorrow's meeting. Catherine paused. One more thing. The investigators have confirmed Mark's relationship with Stephanie began approximately 8 months ago. 8 months. While I was undergoing fertility treatments. While I was injecting hormones into my body every night, enduring painful procedures, and crying over negative pregnancy tests, all with Mark's apparent support and participation. The betrayal cut deeper than I had imagined possible. Caroline? Catherine's voice brought me back to the present. Are you all right? I will be, I managed. See you tomorrow at 2. That evening, alone in my grandmother's, now my, elegant bedroom, I allowed myself to fully process this new information. 8 months of deception. 8 months of coming home from another woman's bed to hold my hand during doctor's appointments, to administer injections, to comfort me through failed cycles. The depth of the betrayal was breathtaking. I curled around my small bump, whispering promises to the tiny life growing inside me. Promises of honesty, protection, and a family legacy of strength rather than deception. Morning brought renewed determination. I dressed carefully for the settlement conference in a custom maternity suit that conveyed both Bennett's sophistication and maternal softness. Gran approved my choice with a decisive nod. Remember, she advised as I prepared to leave. In negotiations, silence is often more powerful than speech. Let him fill the uncomfortable gaps. The conference took place in a neutral location, a private room at the Harvard Club, arranged by Jennifer Oakes. When Catherine and I arrived precisely at 2, Mark and Jennifer were already seated at the polished mahogany table. Mark looked terrible. His usual impeccable appearance had deteriorated noticeably. His bespoke suit slightly rumpled, dark circles under his eyes, his normally perfectly groomed hair showing signs of neglect. The professional pressures were clearly taking their toll. Caroline, he greeted me, rising halfway before sinking back into his chair. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Catherine and I took our seats, arranging our materials with deliberate precision. I remained silent, following Gran's advice, letting the weight of Mark's anxiety fill the room. We've prepared a revised settlement proposal, Jennifer began, sliding folders across the table. Mr. Morrison is willing to make significant concessions in the interest of an amicable resolution. Catherine reviewed the document with practiced efficiency. Interesting. Full agreement to Ms. Bennett's custody terms, increased child support, waiver of any claim to the Nantucket property. She glanced up. What prompted this sudden generosity? Mark and Jennifer exchanged looks before he cleared his throat. I've had time to reflect on my actions. I understand the harm I've caused, and I want to make things right. The room fell silent. Catherine raised an eyebrow at me, signaling that the floor was mine. 8 months, I said quietly, meeting Mark's gaze for the first time. You've been seeing Stephanie for 8 months. His face paled slightly. Caroline, 8 months during which I was undergoing fertility treatments. 8 months of hormone injections and doctor's appointments and disappointments. My voice remained steady despite the emotion behind my words. 8 months of building nursery Pinterest boards and reading parenting books and planning for the family you apparently never wanted. Mark looked down at his hands. It was a mistake. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or buying the wrong brand of coffee, I replied. 8 months of sustained deception while watching your wife go through medical procedures to conceive your child is a choice, a series of daily choices. Catherine placed a gentle hand on my arm, a reminder to stay focused on the legal matters at hand rather than emotional confrontation. I nodded slightly, acknowledging her guidance. Your settlement offer addresses many of our concerns, but it's missing something crucial. What's that? Jennifer asked when Mark remained silent. Accountability, I said simply. Not just financial, but public. Mark's head snapped up. What? Does that mean? Catherine withdrew a document from her portfolio. We've prepared a counterproposal. The financial and custody terms are acceptable with minor modifications. However, we've added a morality clause regarding Mr. Morrison's behavior during visitations with the child, including a prohibition against introducing the child to Ms. Rogers or any other romantic partners without prior written approval until the child reaches the age of 5. That's unnecessarily restrictive, Jennifer protested. Is it? Catherine's tone remained perfectly professional. Given Mr. Morrison's demonstrated pattern of poor judgment regarding his family obligations, we believe these protections are entirely appropriate. Mark leaned toward his attorney, whispering urgently. After a brief, heated exchange, Jennifer straightened in her chair. We might consider such terms, with a defined sunset period, she conceded. What else? A formal acknowledgement of fault. In the divorce filing, Catherine continued, specifically adultery and abandonment during pregnancy. Absolutely not, Jennifer responded immediately. That would be professionally damaging. More damaging than an SEC investigation? I asked quietly. The room went still. Mark's expression shifted from surprise to carefully controlled alarm. I don't know what you're referring to, Jennifer said, but her tone lacked conviction. Let's not play games, Catherine interjected smoothly. We're aware of potential regulatory interest in certain deals Mr. Morrison oversaw. Nothing may come of it, of course. But contested divorce proceedings tend to invite additional scrutiny into all aspects of one's life, professional and personal. Mark and Jennifer conferred again, this time in more urgent whispers. When they finished, Mark looked directly at me. What do you really want, Caroline? He asked, echoing the question he'd posed after our first meeting. What I've always wanted, I replied honestly. A family built on mutual respect and integrity. Since that's no longer possible with you, I want to protect my child from further harm and create a stable foundation for their future. I met his gaze steadily. The acknowledgement of fault isn't about punishing you, Mark. It's about establishing truth as the baseline for whatever comes next, including our co-parenting relationship. Something shifted in his expression. Perhaps the first, genuine moment of reflection I'd seen since this ordeal began. I'll accept the fault acknowledgement, he said finally, overriding his attorney's attempt to intervene. With the condition that it remains in the legal filings only, not in any public statement. Agreed, Catherine replied before I could speak. We have no interest in public humiliation, only legal clarity. The remainder of the meeting focused on finalizing the technical aspects of our agreement. By the time we concluded 3 hours later, we had the framework of a settlement that protected my child's interests, while allowing Mark to preserve what remained of his professional reputation. As we prepared to leave, Mark asked for a moment, alone. Catherine gave me a questioning look, but I nodded my assent. 5 minutes, she said, gathering her materials. We'll be right outside. When the door closed behind our attorneys, Mark seemed to deflate slightly, the professional veneer giving way to genuine exhaustion. You knew about the Bennett fortune all along? He said finally. Through our entire marriage. Yes. Why keep it secret? Why live as we did when you could have? He gestured vaguely. All this? Because I wanted a partner who valued me for myself, not my family name or resources. I rested my hands protectively over my bump. I wanted to know who you really were, and now you do. The words hung between us, heavy with implication. Now I do. I agreed quietly. Mark ran a hand through his disheveled hair. For what it's worth, I did love you, Caroline, in the beginning. I believe you did, but love without integrity isn't enough. I stood, gathering my belongings. The Bennett name and resources didn't change who I am, Mark. Just as Stephanie and professional pressure didn't change who you are. They simply revealed it. As I reached the door, he called after me. The SEC investigation. It's not what you think. I made some aggressive calls, but nothing illegal. I turned back one last time. For your sake, I hope that's true. Our child deserves to have both parents maintain their dignity, even separately. Outside in the Harvard Club's wood-paneled hallway, Catherine was waiting. Well? She asked as we walked toward the elevator. We have a framework we can live with, I replied. And I think we've seen the last of Mark's resistance. Catherine nodded approvingly. You handled that masterfully. Your father would be proud. As we descended in the elevator, I felt my baby move, a subtle flutter that might have been mistaken for nerves had I not been paying attention. My first definitive feeling of movement, a reminder that regardless of Mark's choices, something beautiful was emerging from our broken marriage. By the time I returned to the apartment, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across Central Park. Gran was waiting in the library, a pot of tea at her elbow, and a knowing look in her. Eyes well? She prompted as I sank gratefully into the chair opposite her. It's nearly done, I said, accepting the cup she offered. Not the ending I expected, but perhaps the one we needed. Endings are just beginnings in disguise, Gran replied with the wisdom of her 84 years. The question is, what beginning will you choose now? As if in answer, my phone chimed with an email from Diana Marcus, final details about my office, start date, and first projects. A new professional chapter. The baby fluttered again beneath my hand, the promise of the most important new beginning of all. And somewhere in my heart, a quiet certainty was taking shape. This was not the family story I had planned, but perhaps it was the one I was meant to live. One where challenges revealed strength I hadn't known I possessed, and where betrayal ultimately led to greater authenticity. The Bennett legacy would continue, not through the marriage I had lost, but through the child I would raise and the life I would rebuild. Stronger, wiser, and entirely on my own terms. 3 months passed with remarkable swiftness. Winter settled over New York, transforming Central Park into a snow-dusted wonderland visible from my apartment windows. At 8 months pregnant, I had settled into a rhythm that balanced my new professional responsibilities with preparations for the baby's arrival. The divorce was finalized with surprising efficiency once Mark accepted the terms we'd negotiated. As Catherine had predicted, the potential SEC scrutiny had proven to be powerful leverage, not because Mark had done anything illegal, as our investigation eventually concluded, but because the additional attention had damaged his standing at Griffin Capital beyond repair. The paperwork came through this morning, Catherine announced during our weekly check-in call. As of 9:17 a.m., you are officially Caroline Bennett again, single woman and soon-to-be mother. I placed a hand on my now prominent belly, feeling the vigorous movements that had become increasingly pronounced. How does it feel to be free before you even arrive? I whispered to my unborn child. Caroline, are you still there? Catherine's voice pulled me back to our conversation. Yes, sorry. Just talking to the baby. I shifted in my seat, trying to find a comfortable position. Has Mark signed the final custody agreement? All executed. Standard visitation rights once the child is 3 months old, supervised visits before that, and all the protective clauses we discussed. Catherine paused. He also included a personal letter that was filed with the court. Would you like me to read it? I hesitated. Mark and I had communicated exclusively through our attorneys since the settlement conference. The last I'd heard, he had accepted a position with a smaller firm in Boston, a significant step down from his Griffin Capital Partnership track, but a fresh start away from the professional damage he'd suffered in New York. Yes, I decided finally. I'd like to hear it. Catherine cleared her throat. To the Honorable Judge Michaels and to Ms. Caroline Bennett, I hereby acknowledge full responsibility for the dissolution of my marriage. My actions were inexcusable, particularly given my wife's pregnancy. While no words can undo the harm caused, I wish to state for the record my profound regret and my commitment to fulfilling all parental obligations to our child with integrity and consistency. I ask not for forgiveness, but for the opportunity to be a responsible father despite my failures as a husband. Respectfully submitted, Mark Morrison. Silence hung between us as I absorbed his words. It's more than we required, Catherine noted. The acknowledgement of fault would have been sufficient for the court. Yes, I agreed quietly. It is. After ending the call, I wandered through the now completed nursery. The Bennett family crib stood in the center, its cherry wood gleaming in the winter sunlight. The walls had been painted a soft sage green, adorned with carefully selected art, including a series of Audubon prints that had hung in my own childhood bedroom. My phone chimed with a text from Diana Marcus. Committee approved your proposal. For the Children's Hospital installation. Board is impressed with your vision. Rest this weekend. Doctor's orders. The Marcus position had proven to be everything promised and more. My arts integration program for the Children's Hospital was already receiving national attention, with several medical institutions requesting consultations on similar initiatives. Gran appeared in the doorway, immaculately dressed as always despite, claiming to be relaxing during her extended New York stay. The Monet looks perfect there, she commented, nodding toward the small watercolor landscape I'd hung opposite the changing table. Something beautiful for the baby to focus on. Do you think it's too valuable for a nursery? I asked, adjusting a cushion in the window seat. Gran snorted delicately. Art is meant to be lived with, not locked away. Your father understood that. Besides, Bennett babies have always been surrounded by beauty. She settled into the rocking chair, her posture perfect despite her 84 years. Speaking of your father, Thomas Harrington called. The trust's quarterly performance exceeded expectations. That's good news. Indeed, the education fund for the baby is already fully allocated. Gran's eyes twinkled. Harvard, Yale, or Princeton. Your choice, though I still maintain the Bennett. Tradition of Yale has served us well. I laughed, placing a hand on my lower back to ease the persistent ache. Let's let the baby be born before we pick graduate schools, shall we? The doorbell chimed, and Mrs. Chen appeared moments later. Miss Caroline, Ms. Melanie Caldwell is here to see you. Melanie stood uncertainly in the foyer, clutching a gift bag and looking around with poorly concealed awe at the apartment's grandeur. Despite Andrew's assurance that she was still welcome in my life, this was her first visit since my separation from Mark. Caroline, she breathed, embracing me awkwardly around my belly. You look amazing. Enormous, you mean, I replied with a smile, leading her to the library where tea had been arranged. But healthy. How are you? The initial moments were strained, both of us carefully avoiding mention of Mark or Andrew's role in the divorce. Gradually, as we sipped tea and exchanged updates on mutual friends, the tension eased. I've missed you, Melanie finally admitted. I've been so worried, but I didn't know if... After everything with Andrew... You're not responsible for your husband's professional choices, I assured her, or for Mark's personal ones. She visibly relaxed. Have you heard he's moved to Boston? Catherine mentioned it. I kept my tone neutral. He's different now. Humbled. Melanie hesitated. Andrew says he's in therapy, trying to understand why he sabotaged everything. I nodded, unsure how to respond. Mark's personal journey toward self-awareness wasn't my concern anymore, though I hoped for our child's sake that it was genuine. Enough about him, Melanie said decisively, reaching for the gift bag. This is for the baby. From me, not from us. Inside was a hand-knitted blanket in soft cream wool. You made this? I asked, touched by the countless hours of work it represented. During all those nights Andrew was working late on cases. She smiled ruefully. I learned to knit to keep myself occupied. Turns out I'm actually good at it. As we continued talking, I realized how much I'd missed her friendship. Melanie had been there from the beginning, witnessing my marriage, supporting my fertility struggles, and now, despite complicated loyalties, she was here for the end and new beginning. Would you consider being the baby's godmother? I asked. Impulsively, her eyes widened. Really? After everything, won't it be awkward with Mark? Life is long and complex, I replied, echoing something my father used to say. I want my child surrounded by people who demonstrate integrity and loyalty. You've shown both, even in difficult circumstances. Tears welled in her eyes. I would be honored. After Melanie left, promising to return for a proper baby shower being organized by Diana Marcus, I retreated to my study to review some final proposals for the foundation. Working until my due date had been my choice, supported by my doctors who confirmed that mentally engaging work was perfectly healthy as long as I rested appropriately. Mrs. Chen appeared with a light dinner on a tray. You've been working for 3 hours, Miss Caroline. Time to eat and rest. As I ate, I scrolled through emails, pausing at one from an unfamiliar address, markmorrisonhainesglobal.com. My finger hovered over the delete button before curiosity won out. Caroline, I received notification that the divorce was finalized today. While I understand we agreed to communicate through attorneys, there are some things I feel I must say directly, even if you never respond. First, congratulations on your position with the Marcus Foundation. Diana mentioned your children's hospital project when we accidentally encountered each other at a finance conference last month. Your success is well-deserved and entirely your own, something I failed to recognize during our marriage. Second, I want to apologize again, not for legal purposes but for human ones. The past 6 months have given me time to reflect on who I became during our marriage and particularly in its final year. The man who asked for a divorce while you were carrying our child is someone I'm ashamed to have been. Therapy is helping me understand the insecurities and ambitions that drove my choices, though understanding is not excusing. I betrayed not just our vows, but the basic human decency that should exist between two people who once loved each other. I've accepted the position in Boston partly to give you space in New York, your city, as it turns out, far more than it was ever mine. I will honor all custody arrangements and will never contest your primary role in our child's life. Finally, I want you to know that despite my inexcusable behavior, I am committed to being a positive presence in our child's life. Not to gain access to your family name or resources as you once feared, but because it's the right thing to do. The only thing to do. You don't owe me forgiveness or even a response. I simply wanted to speak these truths directly to you, once, before we embark on our new separate journeys. With respect and regret, Mark, I read the email twice, searching for hidden agendas or manipulations. Finding none, I closed it without responding, neither accepting nor rejecting his olive branch. Time would reveal whether his words reflected genuine change or momentary contrition. The baby kicked vigorously, as if registering an opinion. "I know," I murmured. "It's complicated. Life usually is." 2 weeks later, during a light snowfall that transformed Manhattan into a hushed wonderland, my water broke during a Foundation video conference. Diana, witnessing the moment on screen, efficiently ended the call and dispatched the Marcus family doctor to escort me to Mount Sinai Hospital, where a private suite had already been arranged. "Call Catherine," I instructed Mrs. Chen between contractions. "And Gran. She's at her club lunch." The next 12 hours passed in a blur of focused breathing, encouraging medical professionals, and the surprisingly powerful presence of my grandmother, who at 84 demonstrated a calm strength that anchored me through the most challenging moments. "Bennett women have been doing this for generations," she reminded me, her usually perfect coiffure slightly disheveled as she held my hand through a particularly intense contraction. "Your great-grandmother delivered your grandfather during a blizzard with only a midwife in attendance. You have an entire medical team and epidural options." Catherine arrived with prenatal documents and the birth plan, ensuring every legal aspect was addressed, including the immediate filing of sole physical custody papers as outlined in our divorce agreement. "Mark called," she informed me during a quiet moment. "He asked to be notified when the baby arrives." I nodded through the haze of focused concentration. "That's fine. He should know when his child is born." At 3:17 a.m., after a final heroic effort, my daughter entered the world with a decisive cry that seemed to announce her Bennett heritage more clearly than any DNA test could have. "Elizabeth Caroline Bennett," I whispered as the nurses placed her on my chest. We had agreed that Mark's surname would not be passed down, another concession he had made during our negotiations. She had my dark hair, my father's chin, and eyes that hinted at Mark's family coloring. A perfect combination of genetic inheritances that would shape, but not define her. As dawn broke over the city, I held my sleeping daughter while Gran dozed in the visitor's chair. Catherine had departed after ensuring all legal paperwork was properly filed, and the stream of medical staff had temporarily subsided. My phone chimed softly with a text message from a Boston number. "Congratulations on Elizabeth's birth. Thank you for allowing me to be notified. I respect your space and privacy during this time and will honor all agreements regarding visitation. Wishing you both well." Marky studied Elizabeth's peaceful face, marveling at how someone so tiny could represent such an enormous change in life's direction. 6 months ago, I had been a pregnant wife being asked for a divorce, convinced my world was ending. Now I was a mother, a foundation director, and a woman who had discovered strengths I hadn't known I possessed. The Bennett Trust Fund had indeed turned the tables, but not in the way I had initially imagined. It wasn't about the money itself. It was about the confidence, resources, and freedom it had provided at a crucial moment. The financial security had created space for me to respond strategically, rather than reactively, to protect my child's future without being constrained by economic necessity. Gran stirred in her chair, her eyes opening to focus immediately on Elizabeth and me. "She's perfect," she observed, moving to stand beside the bed. "Your mother would have been so proud. I wish she could have met her. My mother had died of cancer when I was in college, never knowing I would one day give her a granddaughter. She's meeting her in ways we don't understand," Gran replied with uncharacteristic sentimentality. She straightened, her practical nature reasserting itself. "Now, about the christening. The Bennett gown has been preserved properly. It's nearly 200 years old, you know. We'll need to speak with St. Thomas about dates." I smiled, allowing her to plan the traditional ceremonies that had marked Bennett family milestones for generations. These connections to the past would provide Elizabeth with roots and context for her future, something I valued even more deeply after the upheaval of recent months. Diana and Robert Marcus sent an extravagant arrangement of white, Orchids with a note confirming my maternity leave was set at 6 months, with flexible work-from-home arrangements to follow. The nursery at the foundation offices would be completed by my return. Melanie arrived that afternoon with tears in her eyes and another handmade blanket. "She's exquisite," she whispered, carefully holding Elizabeth. The perfect new beginning. The day progressed. I received calls and messages from board members, museum directors, and artists I'd worked with, people who had known me professionally rather than as Mark's wife. Their congratulations felt different somehow, acknowledging me as Caroline Bennett in my own right. When evening fell, the hospital staff dimmed the lights, creating a cocoon of tranquility. Elizabeth nursed contentedly while I gazed out at the city lights scattered like earthbound stars across the Manhattan skyline. My phone chimed with an email notification, Diana sharing press coverage of our children's hospital art installation, which had been featured in the New York Times Arts section. Professional validation that would have once seemed like a dream. "Your mommy built that," I whispered to Elizabeth. "Before you were born, when everything was uncertain, that project helped me remember who I was beyond the roles of wife or mother." She blinked sleepily, her tiny hand curled around my finger with surprising strength. In that grip, I felt the future, all its possibilities, challenges, and joys. On the nightstand, my grandmother had placed a small velvet box I hadn't noticed earlier. With Elizabeth cradled in one arm, I reached for it, finding a note in Gran's elegant handwriting, for Elizabeth Caroline Bennett, to remind her of her legacy, to be given on her 16th birthday with the story of her remarkable mother. Inside was a delicate gold locket, the Bennett family crest engraved on one side. Opening it revealed 2 miniature photographs, my father on one side and my mother on the other. The grandparents Elizabeth would know only through stories and images. Tears welled as I closed the locket, returning it to its box for safekeeping until my daughter was old enough to understand its significance. By then, the divorce and drama of her prenatal months would be ancient history, footnotes in her origin story rather than defining chapters. What would matter was the family we created moving forward, the Bennett women who rallied around her, the godmother who supported us through complicated loyalties, the professional colleagues who respected her mother's contributions, and yes, even the father in Boston who might yet prove himself worthy of a relationship with his daughter. Elizabeth's eyes drifted closed, her breathing settling into the perfect rhythm of infant slumber. In that peaceful moment, I realized that what had initially felt like an ending, Mark asking for a divorce while I was pregnant, had actually been the beginning of something far more authentic and powerful. The trust fund had indeed turned the tables, not by allowing me to punish Mark, but by freeing me to discover who Caroline Bennett truly was beyond the roles and relationships that had previously defined me. As Elizabeth slept in my arms, I made her a silent promise. "Your life won't be perfect, sweetheart. No life is. But it will be authentic. You'll know who you are, where you come from, and that your worth isn't determined by anyone else's validation." Outside, snow began falling again, covering the city in a blanket of hushed white. Inside our hospital sanctuary, Elizabeth and I rested in the quiet confidence that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, we would face them with the strength of Bennett women who had weathered their own storms across generations. Resilient, resourceful, and ultimately remarkable. The trust fund had turned the tables, but love, integrity, and self-discovery would write the rest of our story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.